Make sure I'm on. Yeah, you can hear me, right? Well, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to start the story. And Don, thanks for finding that very difficult song for us to sing. I was thinking Blue Skies and Rainbows, maybe, 728B. But that was a workout right there. So y'all are probably all tired. Let's all catch our breath. We're going to be in Genesis today, but if you have your story, and I hope you're reading along, remember, this only works if we are diligent about reading the chapter in the story and talking about it together. We want to have a common read. We want to have a common conversation. We want it to be intergenerational. And so I hope that you'll be a reader of the story. If you haven't picked up your copy, we've got some available after church. Make sure you pick up a copy for yourself this week. If you're visiting and if you're wondering we have enough for you, we do. Please make sure and grab a copy of that. As you know, ministers have a very poor sense of humor. We find humor in things no one else finds humor in. For instance, in the Bible, the shortest person in all the Bible is not Nehemiah. It's Bildad the Shuhite. Also, the first tennis match in the Bible, Joseph served in Pharaoh's court. Or the first baseball game in the Bible, in the big inning. And that's where we'll be today. So if you have your Bible, turn to Genesis chapter 1. We'll be in the big inning today. Y'all don't like those? Good. That tells me you have taste. I want us to be thinking today about what you can do between two trees. What can you do between two trees? Well, it looks very inviting to put a hammock between two trees, doesn't it? Other people might rappel or zip line between two trees. If you wanted to, you could even live between two trees. And it's with that in mind that I'd like for you to be thinking with me today about the story. We begin in Genesis, and what we believe about Genesis is that it's part of the first 5 books of the Old Testament that are either called the Torah, the law, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. But what we understand about these books is that they were written by Moses, and there's various dates for Moses, but I'm pretty sure around 1445 BC is the time that Moses begins to sit down and write what becomes the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Now, if you think about that, Moses was prepared to do this because he grew up in Pharaoh's household. Remember how he was taken in by Pharaoh's daughter, and he was being prepared to perhaps be the prince, the ruler of Egypt. And so he would have had the intellectual and the training to do the writing that this would involve. But Moses is writing about things that happened long ago. If you're a young earth creationist and you believe the earth is very young, then he's writing about things that happened 2,600 years before him. If you believe the earth is even billions of years old, then he's writing about things that happened a long, long time before himself. And just to put it in perspective, in 600 BC, 2,600 years ago from now, 2,600 years ago from today, the Assyrians and the Egyptians were the world powers at that time. And so it just helps us to appreciate that was a long time ago that he's writing. But we can locate the things that he's writing about in what's called the Fertile Crescent. Have you heard that word before, the Fertile Crescent? It's an arc that begins in the Persian Gulf and makes its way around by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers and then around to the Mediterranean Sea. And what you'll discover is at the time of the writing of Genesis and as it looks back to the history of civilization, most people lived and moved along the Fertile Crescent. It was where life was lived. Those areas around it that say desert, they really were deserted because no one could inhabit them. And so the things that we're looking at and the story that we'll begin with today probably happened either in the Persian Gulf, because the Persian Gulf used to be smaller than it is today, or just outside above the Persian Gulf. But you can see how this Fertile Crescent works. Wow, I did that. But I thought if you want to see where that is today, it's in Iraq, a place that's become familiar in our news. So Genesis, where we begin today, is a word that means beginnings. Beginnings. And you'll notice that often the Bible names a book after the first words to come from it. But here it's very significant, beginnings. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we'll notice today that the book of Genesis is a book of many beginnings. God is doing things among us. But as we read the first verse, what we discover, and what the early church often said, is there was no time when God was not. There was no time when God was not. Now that's important for us to understand because of the way that we think. We think, okay, well, where's the beginning of this? Where's the beginning of this? Well, when it comes to God, there is no beginning. There was no time when God was not. What we discover about our God is He stands outside of time. Time is something that He has created, but it is not something that He has to live within. So look in Genesis 1 and 2. In the beginning, God. God created the heavens and the earth. That's a way of saying in the beginning, God did it all. This is the overview of the first 2 chapters. In the beginning, God created everything. And here's how He began. The earth was formless and void. There's some kind of chaos, some kind of mass, and darkness is over the face of the deep, and there is no light, and the Spirit or the breath of God is hovering over the waters. And then what we discover is that God speaks. And when God speaks, things begin to happen. In Psalm 29, the writer says, "The voice of the Lord is powerful and majestic. The voice of the Lord rumbles over the waters and over the seas." It's God's voice that speaks everything into existence by the power of His word. Have you ever noticed that you can think a thought and be really good with it, but when you verbalize it, you get all blubbery and you begin to cry? I do this often with my kids. You know, I'm real proud of them. I'll want to say something and I can think it just fine, but when I verbalize it, I get emotional. There's something in the way that God created us that when we speak something, it becomes powerfully real. And that is because of the way God designed us. But God spoke and things began to happen. And Genesis basically tells us in the first chapter about how God went about, in poetic form, creating our world. And if you read it, what it tells us is that over the first 3 days, God forms creation. Can you say that word with me? Forms. Forms, okay? So on the first 3 days, notice God forms all of creation. You've got light and darkness on day 1. You've got sky and sea on day 2. You've got land and waters and sky on day 3. And then on day 4, He fills what He formed on day 1. On day 5, He fills what He formed on day 2. On day 6, He fills what He formed on day 3. God is a God of order. God is a God of design. And I asked my students just last week, when you read Genesis 1 and 2, is it a manual about how God did it, or does it tell you more about who God is and the nature of this God who did it all? Now, I'm not saying it's either one or the other, but I'm asking you to think, what is the primary purpose of Genesis chapter 1? Hebrews 11 says it this way: by faith, we understand the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. There's 3 things I want you to notice the Hebrew writer says we should all carry with us out of reading Genesis 1 and 2. It's that God created everything, visible and invisible. It all comes from God. Number 2, Everything was created at God's command. Nothing is random. Nothing is chance. God speaks, and the earth is created. And number 3, everything was created from nothing. God is the first cause of everything. And so what that allows us to do is to understand when we start thinking about our God, when we go outside and we look and we see this wonderful world, what we discover about our God is that God is greater than creation. He stands apart from it, and He is greater than it. That all of creation is under God's control, and that creation is not random. Creation happened orderly by a God who created it. And so one of the things that we can say about our world is that there is an intelligent design behind the world. That's what Paul's arguing for in Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2, is that this world isn't something that happens by chance, and that any person that begins to look at our world should understand that our world screams that behind this creation is a creator, that God is the one who created all of this. I remember 2004 when the most famous atheist in the world came out and said, I was wrong. I've told you for all my life that there is no God. And I've come to the conclusion that there has to be an intelligent designer behind the creation. There just has to be. And he goes on to talk about how it was DNA sequencing that made him finally come to the realization there's just too much intelligence that's gone into our world for it to be something of chance. Genesis 1, he could have read it and seen that there is a God who is orderly in all that He creates. So God said, as the pinnacle of creation, let us create man in our image, after our likeness. The first thing that we should notice as we're reading through Genesis chapter 1 is that we are the climax of creation. How does that make you feel? To know of everything that God created, sun, moon, stars, hippopotamus, and duck-billed platypus, when God created you, that was the climax of creation. It's not something we should take for granted. It's not something that we should just say, oh yeah, sure, of course. No. The text tells us that you were created in the image of God. You are the imago Dei of God in the creation. There's something different about you from every other species. Every other created thing, God said, when I created you, you're different. You have responsibility. You have things I need you to do. And what God tells those that He first created is that you're blessed to go be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and to have dominion over the earth. Dominion does not mean abuse the earth, but you are the caretaker of the earth. You are the one to care for all that has been created. And then God, out of His sovereign grace, gave us a day off where He said that you should rest. And God built into His creation a Sabbath like a metronome that says every seventh day you should quit doing what you're doing and rest. And God says that the holiest day of the week is the one when you don't do, but you rest in what God has done. God builds this into the fabric of His creation. So we've got Adam and Eve, and we've got them created, but then we notice in Genesis chapter 2, there's another creation account. And some people wonder, well, why were there two creation accounts? And I just want to say Moses was a smart guy. And these are not contradictory creation accounts. The first account in Genesis 1 is what we would call a macro creation story. It tells the creation of everything. And the second story in Genesis chapter 2 hones in on the sixth day and says, this is how God created us. And so it's a story that has all kinds of word plays in it I wish I could tell you about. But Adam was formed from Adamah, the ground, the dirt. Woman, Isha, was formed from man, Ish. And so there's all these word plays going on. But what I want us to notice in Genesis chapter 2 is that woman is the climax of creation. No other creation story, and there are over 30 creation stories that have been found in civilization, none of them make woman the climax of creation except our story. And it is when woman is created that everything is very good. And man has found that which completes him. So woman, man, creation, and what we also get is God's definition of marriage. Adam says, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She came out of me. She completes me. And God designs marriage in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. And I'll be holding a seminar coming up on marriage that I'll do on an afternoon. I need to make sure I get it scheduled at a time that's right. But I want us to know that I'm going to follow up a little bit more on this. I just don't have time this morning. Because what I wanted us to notice is that there's a beautiful garden. And in the middle of this beautiful garden are two trees. One of them is the knowledge of good and evil. And the other one, the tree of life. And these two abide in the center of the garden. And man and woman are living there in fellowship with God. I believe if you read the text and you really pay thoughtful attention to it, I'm pretty sure that God was showing up every day in the afternoon to disciple Adam and Eve. It's the cool of the day and God shows up. And he has a conversation with them every day about how they can grow into a better God follower. And they're living there with God and everything is wonderful because notice what God has done in the first two chapters. The first two chapters give us God's first word about creation. It is good. God's first word about humankind, that we are made in the image of God. God's first word about rest and recreation. You should keep the Sabbath. God's first word about relationships. It's not good for a man or any person to be alone. God's first word for marriage. Therefore, a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they will become one flesh. God's first word about work. God placed man in the garden to tend it and to take care of it. God's first word about the environment. We are to work and to take care of God's creation. If you just read Genesis 1 and 2, what a great world we live in. What a wonderful thing God has done. He's created this beautiful world. He's placed us in the center of it as His image to care for it and to provide for it. He's given us a helpmate, one who completes us, and we live in marriage together. God comes and walks with us in the cool of the day. Could the story be any grander, any more wonderful? But what we know is that it doesn't take long for us to make a mess out of God's story. What we know is that the serpent comes along and asks the question that Satan is still whispering into my ear every day. Do you all ever hear it? Did God really say? Really? And what Satan wants us to do, just like with Adam and Eve, is to question God. and to ask the question that's at the heart of every question we ask in our self-talk. And you know what that question is? Does God really have my best interest at heart? That's what's constantly being whispered in my ear. Does God really care for you? Does He really want what's best for you? Don't you need to go your own way? Don't you need to do what you need to do to actualize your own life? And we all have made a mess of things. And sin has separated each one of us from God. And there was a tree of life in the center of the garden, and we could have taken from it and have eaten, and we could have abided with God forever. But we've been driven out, never to return to Eden again. And by the time you go from chapter 3 to chapter 6, what we discover is that you want to talk about a big bang. The big bang of the Bible is the big bang of sin entering into the world. And when sin comes, it begins to corrupt everything. And by the time you get to chapter 6, God saw that the wickedness of man was so great on the earth, and that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil all the time. And so God decided to act and to destroy the earth with water. Here's another way to imagine that. God pushed the reset button on His world. He said, it's like He's picked up the Etch-a-Sketch and He's shaking it and saying, we're going to start again. You want to talk about beginnings? God shakes and starts again. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And our story will now move through Noah to what God's plan will be for us next week. But what do I want you to notice today? I told you that we live between two trees. We can look back and we can see that there was a time when we lived in absolute fellowship with God, in a perfect world, where everything we could imagine was taken care of and provided for. We were blessed. And instead of honoring God, rebellion set in, we went our own way, and we were banished from the garden and from the tree of life, never to go back from whence we came. But what we know, if we read the end of the story, chapter 31 of our story, is that in chapter 31, God has taken that tree of life that was in the Garden of Eden, and He has said, I'm creating a new Eden for you. It's the one that comes at the end of the story. And if you'll be faithful in following me, being the people of God, the tree that you cannot go back to, you can go forward to live with God for eternity in. We have made a holy, hot mess of this world. Terrell, I figure I might get an amen out of that one. So this world is a mess, and we have made it a mess. And what we know is that even though we have made such a mess of this world, God has promised that He will never push the reset button again until the end. But here's what's beautiful. You can hit the reset button anytime you want to. And if you think about it, what your baptism was, wow. What your baptism was or is you hitting the reset button on your life. It's saying, I want to start over again. I want to do this, but I want to do it with Jesus as the captain of my ship. I want Him to lead me on this journey that I'm going through. And that's why baptism is a baptism where you die to your old life and you rise to live a new one. God is saying you can reset your story And you can begin to live as one who has Jesus as your guide on this journey. Jesus as your guide. Lord, guide me on this story. And Jesus, be my captain of this journey. The story tells us that we have made a mess of it. But God is a God of new beginnings, and God is a God of grace. And God invites us, if we've made a mess of our story, to confess it, to put Jesus on in baptism, and to ask Jesus to be our guide as we move forward on this story towards the tree of life that's promised to us in God's new heaven and new earth. Can we minister to you this morning? Is there anything we can do to help you find your way back into the story that allows you to journey towards God's preferred future for you? Let us minister to you any way we can as we stand and